Hello and welcome attendees. This is Mike Murray of Ford Murray. It's nice to have you today. Thanks for coming. Today we're going to be talking about I-9 basics, and this is going to be the first in a two-part series. Today we're going to cover kind of the fundamental core concepts for I-9s. So if you're new to I-9s, trying to get up to speed, this is a perfect webinar for you to attend. If you've been doing I-9 preparation, but you need a refresher, need to kind of revisit those core concepts, this should be great for you as well. So part two of this series will come next month, and then we'll talk about advanced topics, more exotic kind of circumstances and situations that might come up in I-9 world. But today we're covering the basics. Now, if you are new to the I-9 compliance world, you may have heard rumors in the office that I-9s are boring, I-9s are complicated, the form is non-intuitive, those little boxes kind of drive you crazy. You may have even heard the rumor that if you don't get it just right, you could get in a lot of trouble with the government, the company can be fined. I'm here to tell you that all of those rumors are true. Unfortunately, the I-9 compliance world is not easy. It's very technical. It's hard to kind of get your head around it. So that's the bad news. My job today is to try to walk you through to give you a good kind of opening understanding of why we're having to do this, the best approaches for filling out the different sections of the form. And hopefully at the end of the hour, if I've done my job correctly, you just will have a better sense of confidence in approaching your job and approaching the form and doing it properly. If I've achieved that, let me know. If I could have done it better at the end, send me an email with your suggestions. I would really appreciate it. So what are we going to cover today? We're going to take a tour of the form. For some reason, I'm not able to advance my slide here. Let's see. Sorry for this technical difficulty. Let me pop out and pop back in and see if that works. My apologies. And now we've got it. There we go. We're going to talk about proper completion of I-9 forms. We're going to go over the major rules that you have to follow. We're going to go over the deadlines that you have to complete different portions of the form by. We're also going to take what I call a scenic tour of the form. And what I mean by that is that it's not going to be a beautiful tour. It's going to be a scenic tour in the sense that we're going to slow down and take our time. We're going to go through section 1, section 2, section 3, and really kind of dig into the different boxes so you know how to approach them, and to also kind of highlight the different pitfalls and common errors that I see in my practice. I've been doing I-9 compliance work for over 10 years now. I've done quite a few investigation audit defenses with DOJ and Immigration Customs Enforcement, the departments who enforce the I-9 rules. And I've walked a lot of companies through doing their own internal I-9 audits. So I've really seen it all. Now, I'd like you to take out your Form I-9. If you haven't already, please go ahead and print out a Form I-9. You'll have 9 pages there, and the final 3 pages are the actual form with the list of acceptable documents at the very end. That's pages 7, 8, and 9. Go ahead and print that out or pull it out in front of you. To kind of take a step back and look at a more historical perspective, what's happening with the I-9 obligation is that the government is really pressing private companies into their service to do part of their job. As you know, the immigration rules try to limit those who can enter through our borders, through the airports. Certain folks come here on a tourist visa or work visa, and they overstay, and they become undocumented or illegal. Quite a few people kind of fall through the cracks or make it through the system. It's estimated that we have about 11 million illegal aliens or undocumented foreign nationals in the United States. The I-9 process was set up so that employers would take part in the compliance. The obligation has been put on you guys to kind of do the job that the government has been able to do and restrict those folks who aren't supposed to get an employment benefit in the United States from getting it. Now, how does the government do that or force you to do that or persuade you to do that? through fines and penalties. If you don't do it right, you can be audited, investigated, and the fines can be very substantial. This chart here kind of shows us that the government has really become very interested in I-9 enforcement. What happened was that when the Obama administration took office back in 2008, 2009, they actually made a public statement and a policy to crack down on employment side compliance of I-9s rather than just trying to deport illegal aliens. And that really caused a spike in enforcement actions and in fines assessed. So this chart is telling us or showing us that over the past 7 years or so, the total I-9 fines assessed annually against companies. And you can see that when the new policy went in effect around 2008, 2009, the assessed fees started to go off the chart there. By 2009, we were already over $1 million in assessed fines per year. And then in the past couple of years, we're up at the 16 million, approaching up to the $17 million mark. So the government takes this seriously, and they're making money off this. They have a budget item of about $130 million a year that is dedicated to I-9 enforcement through Immigration and Customs Enforcement. So this is why we have to take our function here in terms of I-9 compliance very seriously and try to approach it in the right way. Now, our first rule in terms of getting our I-9s right is which version should we use? You always have to use the most current version. And the tough thing is that the versions keep on changing. On average, we get a new I-9 form every 3 to 4 years. The forms don't change a whole lot in terms of content, but you can only use the current one that's in place. Now, how do you know you're using the current one? For today, at least, if you look at your I-9 form on page 7 of 9, at the bottom left of that form, there's going to be a version date, 03/08/2013. This is the current form, and it's the only one that you can use at the moment. Now, the problem is that that could change, a couple months from now. A new form can come out. And what I've seen happen with employers is that you create in HR a new employee orientation file. And in that file, you put a bunch of documents that the employees need to sign on the first day, including an I-9 form. You create maybe hundreds of these so that you can efficiently just pluck one out when you need one. The problem is the forms that are in those files will become expired at some point, and no one's going to check to make sure the current form is there. So you have to watch out for that. You have to make sure that you're not using an old form that's gathering dust in some file somewhere. You got to make sure those are updated. In my opinion, the only foolproof way of making sure you're using the current I-9 is each time to pull off the I-9 from the government website, uscis.gov. That's the only source that's going to have the current form every time, in the opinion of the government. I know that's kind of onerous and that would be hard to work into some procedures, but if you're ever worried about having the right form, just go to uscis.gov, search the form I-9, and pull it down, and you should have the most current version. Okay, the overall requirements for the I-9 Section 1, employee information. If you look at Section 1 there on page 7 of 9, that's where the employee is going to sit down and fill out their portion, Section 1 of the form. We're going to hit each of these sections in more detail. I'm just going to broadly go over them at the moment and talk about the procedure a little bit. Section 2 on page 8 of 9 is the employer section to fill out. And that's where you're going to ask the employee to give you a document from either List A or List B and C that proves their identity and their ability to work in the United States. And if you look at that page 9 of 9 of the I-9 form, you'll see that list of acceptable documents. The employee should be able to choose from that list. You should put it in front of them and ask them to make the election of which form they're going to use for the I-9 process. The employer would then review the document, input data into Section 2 of the form under List A, List B, or List C as appropriate, put in a hire date or start date, and then sign the form as certified. Section 3 has to do with re-verification, and that's for employees who have a time-limited type of work status. So let's go ahead and dive into each of those sections and kind of blow up the different parts of the form to give you some guidance on how to approach them. First, let's talk about deadlines. When must the I-9 be completed? There's a big misconception out there that I hear again and again from my clients, and let me test you. Let me throw out a question, and I want you to answer this question in your mind. You don't have to email me or anything. You don't have to say it to your group. You can keep it private. But answer this question in your mind. When do you have to do the I-9 process? Okay, you know your answer. Many people will tell me, well, you've got 3 days. You've got 3 days to do it. It's not correct. The I-9 has to be started on the first day of employment. That section 1, the employee section, has to be filled out on that first day. Section 2 can be completed by the employer by the 3rd day of employment, and really that's the 3rd business day of employment. So the process of actually looking at the employment document and verifying the identity, that can be done on the 3rd day. So it's really kind of a 2-part process there. However, if you have an employee who's going to be working for less than 3 days, then the I-9 actually has to be completed, both sections 1 and 2, on the first day. In terms of section 3, when does that have to be completed? Well, that is the re-verification section on the bottom of 8 of 9. And if that applies to your, most likely for a national worker, you have to make sure you complete the re-verification section before their current work authorization expires. There's no grace period there. You've got to complete it before that expiration date. All right, now let's dig a little more deeply into these sections. Section 1 of Form I-9, if you pull it out there and take a look at the top, this again is the employee section. The first box is the last name. The second box is the first name. We've got the middle initial. The employee is filling this out. It's pretty straightforward. Then we get to other names used. And if your employee doesn't have a maiden name, probably they're not going to have another name. Now you can leave it blank and move on. No, you actually have to put in NA. That is not applicable. This is a new aspect of this latest version, the 2013 version of the I-9 form. So you've got to now put NAs into boxes that are left blank. Okay, so keep that in mind. Now you've got your address box. Note that the address has to be a U.S. address, and it's got to be a physical address. Basically, the government wants to know, how do we find this employee if we need to find him or her? So it cannot be a P.O. box, okay, and it's got to be a U.S. address. To apartment number, if there is no apartment number, you want to put an NA in there. City, state, zip code, all very straightforward. Date of birth, all of that preceding information, if it applies, is required. The next 3 boxes, Social Security card number, email, and telephone number, those are optional. So NAs can be put in there if the employee doesn't want to provide it. However, if you are an E-Verify user, the employee does have to fill out the U.S. Social Security number for E-Verify purposes. So keep that in mind. Now let's go down to the boxes. The boxes 1 through 4 there, stacked on top of each other, it's a very important part of the form. This is where the employee makes their election. This is where they're going to represent to you and to the government. This is my immigration status. This is how I have authorization to work in the United States. You have to make sure one of these boxes are checked. Cannot be left blank. Okay, to do so is a substantive violation. So watch out for that. The first checkbox there, a citizen of the United States, very straightforward. And most of the I-9s you're going to process are probably going to be for U.S. citizens, depending upon your business. The second box is a non-citizen national of the United States. And that, for me, is always kind of a head scratcher. Even as an immigration lawyer, I ask myself, what does that mean? It kind of sounds like an oxymoron, a non-citizen national of the United States. That is a very narrow group of folks who live in Micronesia, on the Marshall Islands, on Cairns Island. Cairns Island has a population of about 17 people. So this is a box that describes a very small set of people in the world. If you find yourself clicking this box, or if you see the employee click the box, let me know, because my theory is that every time box 2 on an I-9 is clicked, an immigration lawyer gets his wings. It's just one of those rare things. So it's probably a box you're never going to have to worry about. Going down to box 3, we have a lawful permanent resident. That's a green card holder in the United States. If that box is clicked, then the individual is going to write in their A number in the space provided there. And then we have the 4th box, an alien authorized to work until a certain date. And these are going to be foreign nationals who have types of work authorized visa status like H-1B or L-1 or TN, or individuals who are applying for asylum or waiting for a green card, and they might have something known as an employment authorization document. If the employee clicks this box, they're going to have to write in a date by which their current status expires there in the blank. And that's important, and we'll talk about that when we get to the re-verification section, section 3. Because that's going to be a part of a tickler system for the employer to kind of watch and make sure that you're re-verifying that expiring work authorization status in the right time. Finally, if you go down to the middle of the form, you'll see the spot where the employee must sign in date, section 1. You have to make sure they do that. Without doing that, they're not honoring the representations that they've made on the form. And in fact, if you don't make sure they do it, it's the employer who assumes the liability for that being incorrect. In the context of an investigation, the government will assume that you haven't done your job properly because it was the employer who should have made sure that section 1 is filled out correctly. So once the employee fills out that section 1, you do want to go over it and make sure that it's legible, that NAs are there, required information is filled out, that one of the boxes are checked, and that it all kind of makes sense. If someone's telling you they're a U.S. citizen, but they click the lawful permanent resident box, you're going to have to ask them to do it over again, okay? Let's go back just for a minute and look at the last 2 certification boxes. As I mentioned, those are important if you have to track whether someone's status is going to expire. So make sure they write in the A number and the admit until date because those trigger that re-verification obligation that we'll get to here in a minute. Okay, now here are some practical tips and things to remember about filling out section 1 and making sure the employee's done it correctly. A question that I often get is, can the employer help out? Because we believe in customer service in our HR department. Can we kind of pre-fill some of the boxes in section 1 or do it for the employee? The answer is no. The employee is the one who has to be allowed to do that. They need to make the representation of who they are, where they live, what their bio information is, and what kind of status they have. Another question I get a lot is, can we tell the new employee which documents to bring in? Because it's just easier to input a passport or a green card or a driver's license, an SSA card. Can we give them a recommendation? And the answer again is no. The employee is the one who has to choose, and they have to be allowed to look at that list A and make the choice for themselves. And this brings up one of the tensions that you're going to find in your I-9 work. Yeah, when you're trained in HR or the legal department, if that's where you do your I-9s, when you come up to conversations about national origin or racial discrimination or immigration status, you're trained to kind of run away. Don't go there. That's a red zone. We don't talk about that stuff. And so you should in the usual case. But if you have to do I-9s, it's actually your job to go right in there and verify someone's work authorized status. How are you here? How do you have the right to work in the United States? Prove to me that you're not an illegal alien. In so many words, that's kind of what you're asking. And so you're in this red zone. And you may feel that tension. How do you negotiate that? How do you navigate that safely? What I tell my clients is to make sure that you let the form do the work. And really, that's what Department of Justice has told us. The employee should not only get the I-9, that last 3 pages, 7 of 9 through 9 of 9, they should also get the first 6 pages, which is the instructions. Now those instructions are pretty long, and chances are you're not going to have enough time in your 15 minutes of orientation for the employee to kind of read it all. However, that doesn't mean that you can kind of do the process for the employee or direct them as to how they can do it. What you should do is point them to that list of acceptable documents, that last page of the I-9. And if you get a question of, what should I bring in? I forgot to bring my documents today. Can I bring in a passport? Can I bring in my birth certificate? You shouldn't tell them which they should bring. You should let them choose. That is the safest way to negotiate that situation. You never want to ask for specific documents. So for example, you don't want to have an HR letter that goes out to a new hire that says, on the first day of employment, make sure you bring either your passport or a birth certificate, driver's license, so that we can complete the I-9 process. That would be directing the employee, and the government may see that as discriminatory because not everyone has a U.S. passport. Not everyone has a U.S. birth certificate. And so that is kind of a red zone area to be in. If in the process of doing I-9s, you get those questions, can you please let me know which documents are acceptable? Just point them again to that list of acceptable documents and let the form do the work for you. Okay, so that completes our overview of Section 1. Let's now move on to Section 2, the Employer Documentation Review and Certification. This is really kind of a two-part process. You have to verify that the employee is who they say they are. And so that is the identity portion of the verification. Then separately, you have to verify that the employment eligibility of the employee is valid. Now, identifying identity is pretty straightforward. They're going to show you either a List A document like a passport, or they're going to show you a List B document like a driver's license. You do have to take a look and just make sure that they look like the picture there. You have to do a good faith review. Okay, you have to be reasonable. That's the standard for your identity verification. It's also the standard for the employment eligibility verification. Now, I get this question a lot. I'm not an immigration lawyer. I don't know what a real green card looks like and what a fake green card looks like. How am I supposed to tell the difference? And the truth is, you don't have to be an immigration lawyer because the legal standard is that you have to do a good faith review. So you have to take a look. If there's something obvious that tips you off that the card looks fake, the fonts are off, the picture is affixed in a strange way, then you would not be able to accept that document. There is an employer handbook on completing I-9s provided by Immigration Customs and Enforcement. And at the back of that, there is a list, there are kind of photos of the different types of documents that you might see. So if you're the primary I-9 preparer at your company, you may want to take a look at that and just familiarize yourself with those different types of documents. As another note, you cannot accept an expired document. It used to be that an expired passport was a valid and acceptable List A I-9 document. That rule changed, so no longer can you accept even an expired U.S. passport. It has to be current. Okay, let's zero in a little more on Section 2 and what's required. Let's tour this Section 2 and look at our different boxes here. If you look at the very top, the first box, it says list the employee name, first name, middle name from Section 1. This is one of the most common mistakes I see in my I-9 work. It's just really easy to miss that box, and it's also not intuitive that you would need to re-enter the employee's name since it's already on Section 1. This is a new component of the new form, so just watch out for that. I see it missed all the time. The reason it's there is so that if the two different pages become detached, you know which one belongs with which. But just watch out and put that in. If you forget to put it in, it is a technical violation, so watch out for that. Then you're going to input the data from the proper document by the employee, either in List A or List B and List C. And we're going to blow one of those boxes up for you here in the next slide to show you how to do that properly. The other box or blank that I see employers missing is in the certification there towards the bottom. There's an arrow towards that blank where you're going to put the first day of employment. For some reason, the human eye just glosses over that blank. I see it missed all the time. And this is probably the biggest error you could make on the form, because that date, that start date, tells the government when the deadlines start for you and the employer in this I-9, and by when you had to complete things within the 1 and 3 day different timelines. So if you miss that, you've kind of ruined the entire process and form. So make sure you always zero into putting that blank in there or filling out that blank. Now, it seems very straightforward at the bottom of the form to simply fill out, your name, the business address, the business name, to print your name. I see mistakes here a lot as well. And the one that I see is that the business address is abbreviated. You're not supposed to abbreviate things on a Form I-9. You have to spell out your entire company name and address. And it gets a little taxing because let's say you're intaking 5 employees on one day. You want to, by that 5th form, you're wanting to just scribble it out quickly. You know where you are. The government probably knows where you are. If they're investigating you, they've already served you a notice at your place of business. But it is a technical violation to abbreviate or shorthand the employer address or the employer name. So watch out for that as well. Okay, here's a blow up of one of the boxes in section 2. Let's say that our employee has proffered to us a U.S. passport. How do we properly fill this out? The document title is the full title, U.S. passport. The issuing authority, you're going to want to put in the full authority on that document, U.S. State Department. If it's a driver's license, maybe it's the state of New York, maybe it's the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. You want to spell that out there in the issuing authority. Then you're going to want to put in your document number. For a passport, that's going to be the passport control number that's at the top right of the passport. For a driver's license, that's going to be the driver's license number. A birth certificate would usually have some kind of registration number on it. So if there is some kind of document number, you're going to want to put it right there. And then you're going to want to put in the expiration date. And this is another way for you to make sure that you're not accepting an expired document like an expired passport. It's also a way to tip you off as to whether or not you're going to have to re-verify someone if they have the type of work status that needs to be re-verified based upon this expiration date. Okay, some practical tips about section 2 now that we know how to fill it out properly. You have to accept any documents specified in List A or List B and C, provided that it appears genuine and relates to the employee. And if the employee has given you a document that you've never seen before, but it's on the list, you have to accept it. You can't pick and choose. At the same time, you've got to make sure that that document is actually on the list. There are sometimes some exotic documents like certification of report of birth issued by the Department of State, things that you may have never seen before. You just want to make sure before you accept it that it's actually on that List C or List A. So go ahead and check it against the acceptable list of documents. Here's an important point, and this can lead to a type of fine called document abuse. You can only accept a minimum required set of qualifying documents, not more. So what does that mean? Let's say you have a new model employee. This person is very detail-oriented. They walk in on the first day and they tell you, man, I am prepared for this I-9 process. I've brought everything I need and more. Look at what I brought for you. I have my passport, I have my driver's license, I have my social security card, I have my birth certificate. Here, I am very qualified to work in the United States. Well, it's great that they brought in the documents. That's wonderful. But you can only accept one set of qualifying documents, not more. So that means you would give the documents back and you would say, employee, this is fantastic work, we appreciate it. However, we only need one set of qualifying documents, so give us the one that you would like us to input onto the form. So let's say they give you the passport. You just input the passport. You would not fill out list A and list B and list C with all those documents. And the reason why the government is worried about that, it's really not intuitive. If they see you filling out all of those lists and accepting more documents than you really need to, they think it's document abuse, and they start worrying that you have a higher standard than you need to have. That you don't want to just see a passport, you want to see a birth certificate, a U.S. birth certificate. And so they think you're setting a standard higher than the law, and that maybe even you're implementing that in a discriminatory way. So that's the concept of document abuse. You want to make sure you're accepting the minimum required set of documents. One other rule to remember is that you cannot ask a candidate for a job to fill out an I-9 prior to an offer of employment. So let's say you have 3 finalists for a position. You just want to get some of your work done in advance. Let's go ahead and send I-9s out to all 3 of those finalists. Can't do it. You have to make sure you only start the I-9 process after an offer has been made. Now, on another note, you can complete the I-9 before the first day of employment. You can do it in advance in that sense. So it's got to be done somewhere between the offer being made and then that first day of employment. That's the window for you to start your I-9 up. Okay, we've made our way to section 3. And this section may apply only to a small subset of the employees that you have. And most of these people are going to be foreign nationals of the United States. Section 3 has to do with employees with time-limited work authorization. Those are going to be employees who have H-1B visas or L-1 intra-company transferee visas, trade NAFTA or TN visas from Canada or Mexico, or those employment authorization documents that I talked about. Also, some green card holders may be subject to this requirement. Now, I pointed out to you before that how you're going to know that someone has a time-limited work authorization is that they're going to list that, or they're going to click that 4th box on the first page of the I-9 form. I'm sorry, that 4th box on the first page. And they're going to tell you, actually, my work authorization will expire on this date. So you want to take those dates and you want to turn that into a tickler system for HR or legal to remember to follow up with those employees. And I would say that you'd want to kind of give them a warning or notice that, the work authorization documents we have on file are going to expire, 4 months from now, 120 days from now. Please do what you need to do to give us new work authorization documentation before the expiration date of the current document. And you want that much lead time because it really can take months for these employees to get the types of work cards or other types of employment authorization proof that they need to show you. So they need to start ahead of time. If they wait till the week before, it could be 90 days before they can get the card, and they would have to come off the payroll during the time they're waiting for that card. Now, the re-verification requirement has only to do with re-verifying work authorization. It does not have to do with re-verifying identity. So you're never going to have to re-verify a driver's license or a military ID card. That's not what this is about. You only have to re-verify work authorization documents. The concept or the question of whether or not you need to re-verify a permanent resident of the United States can get a little tricky. There are different forms of green cards or permanent residence. There's a 2-year conditional type of permanent residence. There's the which usually has a 2-year expiration on the card. There's what I call kind of a permanent residence, which has a 10-year card. Then there are other types of legal evidence of permanent resident status, and that's known as an I-551 stamp, which is kind of a red or pink stamp that's put into a passport. The shorthand for remembering which of those have to be re-verified is that if you have the green card, the quote-unquote plastic green card, that does not have to be re-verified. Even if it's only a 2-year card or a 10-year card, you don't have to re-verify it. If it's the I-551 stamp or some other proof of permanent resident status, then you would have to re-verify that employee and put them into the tickler system. So that's a relatively easy way to remember that standard there. All right, let's go through section 3 box by box. The box A, we're going to put in any new name that the employee got in the time between now and the last time you verified them. So let's say they got married or something like that. You're going to list that new name. Now, note, however, there's no obligation to put in a new name if you're not re-verifying. So let's say, for example, you have a very eager employee who just got married. She comes to your office and says, hey, I have a new name. Can I update all of my HR documents? You'd be happy to help them with that. You are not required to update the I-9 at this point. You can if you want to, but it's not required. So just keep that in mind. Box B, date of rehire, that's actually a separate concept from re-verification. If we look at the title of this section 3, we've got re-verification and rehires. We'll talk about rehires in part 2 of our I-9 webinar series. It gets a little complicated, so let's just table that one for now. Going down to box C, you're now going to input the new work authorization document. You're going to put in your document title, for example, a new employment authorization document. You're going to put in the specific document number of that document. And then you're going to put in any new expiration date for that individual. So let's say they bring you a new EAD card. These cards are usually good for 1 year or 2 years. If they give you a new card that has an expiration date, you got to put that there in the expiration date box. That means you have to re-input them into your tickler system because now you have a new term that's going to expire and you're going to have to track that as well. Now, as another example, that same employee might come back to you. And let's say that employee was an applicant for asylum in the United States. They had an interim EAD that was good for 1 year. But upon re-verification, they brought you a new document. That's absolutely fine. Now it's a green card. They were granted their asylum, and now they're showing you a U.S. permanent residence plastic green card. You're going to input that new document title in there, put the new document number, and there's going to be an expiration date for the card, either 2 years or 10 years, and you can put that in there. But because it's that plastic green card, you're not going to re-verify that individual, okay? And then you're going to remember to put in your name and sign in date the re-verification certification there. All right, we finished our tour of the form. I'm sure that was very exciting for you. Hopefully you have kind of a deeper understanding of what those boxes mean and how to fill them out. I want to cover some other concepts that I see tripping up some of our clients. The first is the receipt rule. And this means that some employees who come to you will tell you, geez, I know I have 3 days to show you one of these documents from the lists. However, I lost my passport and there's no way I can get a new one before that 3 days expires. Or I had my birth certificate, it put through the wash and it's been shredded. I'm going to try to get a new one, but I don't have it today. So this is where the receipt rule comes in. And it has to do with lost, stolen, or damaged documents that the individual already possessed and now are just trying to replace. That's really important. This is not about individuals who are seeking to get some kind of immigration or work authorization status. For example, someone who applied for asylum and is waiting to get their card. They can't bring you the receipt for the card that's going to be issued within 90 days because that wasn't lost, stolen, or damaged. Someone who tells you, well, I'm going to get H-1B status soon. Can I show you the receipt? That doesn't apply here. The receipt rule would not work for them. Okay, so it's only for lost, stolen, or damaged documents. Now, the funny thing about the receipt rule is that it's certainly going to help certain employees and employers and give you more time to kind of get the documents they need. But the I-9 form is really not set up for inputting those receipts. However, there is a procedure for doing it correctly, and that's what I'm going to walk you through here. Just one other note on the receipt rule. You don't get 90 days to proffer the receipt. The receipt has to be given within that 3-day timeline after the start. So an employee on day one who tells you, geez, I lost my passport, can I bring you something in 90 days? It's not good enough. They have to go and apply for the passport right away and give you the receipt within that 3-day period. So make sure that, it's not 90 days to do nothing. It's a couple more days to do what you need to do to get that receipt, and then you've got 90 days for the new document to come in. Okay. So how do you properly input a receipt into Section 2 of the I-9? If you pull up Section 2 there, you're going to enter the document title. Let's say it's a U.S. passport. You're going to enter the word receipt and any document number that might be on that document receipt into the document number box. There may not be a document number, which is okay, but if there is one, you're going to input it there as well. And then in the expiration date box, you're going to enter a date 90 days into the future, okay? And then you're going to enter that individual into your tickler system for follow-up, all right? Now, when the actual document comes in, you're going to cross out the word receipt and any document number, and then you're going to enter the actual document number. And so you would put in the passport control number that you see there on the passport. Then you're going to cross out the 90-day expiration date and enter the actual expiration date of that passport, whatever document it turns out to be. And then you're going to initial and date those changes. Not intuitive, the form is not set up to do that, but the receipt rule is an important tool for you guys, and that is the way that you would use that rule and input it into our I-9 form. Okay, retention of I-9 forms. This is an area that can get a little tricky. We know we have to do I-9s, but for whom? And how long do we have to keep them? A good shorthand is every employee hired after the I-9 implementation date, which was 11/6/1986, must have a completed Form I-9 on file. So you have an active employee on your payroll. They were hired after 1986. Most of them will be. You have to make sure you have an I-9 on file for all of those employees. Now, employers have the ability to terminate or purge I-9s for terminated employees. And really, you want to make sure you do purge the I-9 forms that can be purged. Because if there were mistakes on those I-9s, let's say there was a couple of years, and I see this quite a lot, where the I-9s weren't done properly or they weren't really being focused on. Once they reach the date for purge, you can simply get rid of them. And the government will never see them, and any kind of risk or liability contained on those forms can be removed from the company, shredded, and then you don't have to worry about them anymore. The rule for when you can purge an I-9 is a little tricky. It always takes me a little while to get my head around it. So let's talk it out here, and then I'm going to show you some samples of how it actually works, all right? The rule is you can purge I-9s for terminated employees 3 years from the date of hire or 1 year from the date of termination, whichever is later. And it's that last phrase, whichever is later, that trips up a lot of people. So let's do an example of some start dates and term dates for 2 different employees. Our start date is going to be the same, January 1st, 2000. The term dates are going to be a little different, one in 2011 and one in 2015. We put into our slides here a retention worksheet that you can print off and use for any I-9 that you need to put through this analysis. And then I've given us kind of a cheat sheet for those 2 examples that I showed you before. On the left, we're going to see the dates for the earlier terminated employee, and on the right for the later terminated. So you would enter the employee start date on that line 1. It's going to be January 1, 2010. And then you add 3 years to line 1, which brings us to January 2013. Then you enter the termination date in line 2. And on line B, you're going to add 1 year to line 2. So in our first example, we're going to get the date January 2012. And then just to follow that one out, the first example, you go down to C, which date is later, A or B, enter the date here. And here, it's going to be the 2013 date, which is later. So the one from the top, number 1 line there. They only stayed at the company for 1 year, so you have to use the later date and add 3 years, or I'm sorry, to retain it for at least 3 years, and that's going to be our retention date. So 1/1/2013 at the very bottom in C is going to be the last date that you have to keep that I-9 at your premises, okay? Now, for the employee who was terminated in 2015, the result is going to be different. They were hired on the same date, but in line 2, we have entered a termination date of 1/1/2015. And then under 2B, we're going to add 1 year, which gives us January 1, 2016. And then the later date between A or B is going to be January 1st, 2016. So that I-9 has to be retained until that date. And you can see there's a difference here. They started at the same date, they had different term dates, and therefore we have a 3-year swing in how long the I-9 has to be retained. I know it's a little complicated, but if you simply go back to this worksheet here and you apply it to any single I-9, it's pretty straightforward, and you're going to get the term date or the purge date that you need. Now, it's important, as I said before, to make sure you're purging these I-9s when you can. So what I recommend is that you have a binder, wherever you retain your I-9s, you have a binder that one is dedicated to active employees and the other is dedicated to terminated employees. And so as soon as you know an employee is terminated, then you would move that I-9 from the active binder over to the terminated binder. And then you would take this worksheet and you would work through it and get that date on line C, and that's going to tell you the purge date. And you can put a sticky or just write in pencil that purge date, maybe at the top right of the Form I-9. And then in that terminated binder, you can go ahead and organize those I-9s by date of eligible purge. And maybe once a month, have someone who goes through the binders and shreds, gets rid of those I-9s that can be purged, and any worries or stress you had about any of those I-9s goes away with the I-9. Now, what is the proper method of storing the I-9s? Most of our clients use paper. Paper absolutely works. You're going to keep those original I-9s signed by the employees and the employer. You want to keep those I-9s separate from the employee file. And going down to the bottom of the slide here, the reason you want to do that is because the government recommended, but also because you're only going to get 3 days. If you get a notice of investigation from Immigration Customs Enforcement, they're only going to give you 3 days to turn over your I-9s, whether they're paper or electronic or what have you. And if those I-9s are embedded in employees' files, it's going to be really tough for you to get all of those in order in time. So you want them to be separated and ready to go if the government asks for them. If you want to jump into a hot tub time machine and find a microfiche or microfilm machine on eBay, you are still allowed to do that under the rules. Or you can store your forms electronically. You can make electronic copies, digital copies of the I-9s, and then destroy the originals. But keep in mind that there is some maintenance that's required there for electronic storage of I-9s. You have to make sure that the I-9s are secure, which means that they're restricted access to those employees who need to use them, and not just anyone can access them. You have to have a recovery plan so that if your IT infrastructure gets wiped out, there's some way to recover from a recovery disk or something like that, a backup disk, all of those I-9 forms. The system has to be auditable, which means that the government has to be able to see who accessed the electronic I-9s and whether someone made a change to those I-9s. And then you have to periodically go back and monitor whether there's been any tampering of the forms. Properly correcting an I-9 requires a certain procedure. Whether you're doing an I-9 and you see that you've made a mistake, or you're doing an internal audit, going through your files to make sure that everything's up to snuff, you want to make sure that you're making the corrections in the right manner. And the theme here is that you have to let the government know what you've done. You're not trying to hide the mistake and cover it up. You're making a correction because you know you need to, but you're showing the government what you did. So you want to line through any wrong information in a non-destructive manner. Then you write in the new information in the margin or near the box you're using, and you initial and date the change in real time as you're making the change. You don't ever want to use correction fluid or blacken, cross out information so the government can't see it. And the thing that you really never want to do is to backdate a form. Let's say you do an I-9 and you forget to put the date of completion in section 2. Never go back and make it look like you completed it within the 3-day timeline. If you miss the timeline, you miss the timeline, and so you'll have to sign and date it on the date that you actually signed and dated. To do anything different is taking an I-9 violation, which could result in a fine of some type, but taking that and compounding the problem and turning it into fraud on the government, and that's the thing that you really want to avoid. So watch out for that. I mentioned doing internal I-9 audits. This is the procedure you would use for that. We do have a separate tutorial on I-9 internal audits on our website called How to Conduct an Internal I-9 Audit. So if you're interested in that, check that out or give us a call. All right, what happens when the I-9 is incorrect? What are the penalties that we're talking about? Now, I'll tell you that with the different companies I've worked with, in internal audits or government audits, there are always mistakes. I mean, unless you have a program that you've really focused on and done a lot of training for the I-9 preparers, inevitably you're going to find mistakes. And hopefully you're not so type A that you can't forgive yourself for that or forgive your staff members, because it's just the lay of the land in I-9 world. Some of those are correctable through I-9 audits, some of them are not. The key is to try to be vigilant, to keep up on your training, review the I-9s that are coming through your department to make sure that everything looks like it's correct. There's no way to get perfect I-9s, but you can certainly improve your performance, so that's kind of the goal. And I say that because I don't want to scare you too badly when it comes to these civil fines and criminal penalties. I showed you that chart in the beginning, showing you that the government is really after some revenue here for I-9 violations. And so that's the reality. That's what's happening out there. And it's not uncommon to see penalties against companies in the millions or hundreds of thousands. We've seen that in the last couple of years. So that's out there. This is the penalty scheme. Now, this covers criminal violations and intentional hiring of unauthorized aliens. The folks here on the webinar today are listening to this. You're really not going to be in that group. So in that first column there, knowingly hiring an unauthorized alien, we're not going to be doing that. Committing or participating document fraud, that third row there or column, we're not going to be doing that either. Just know that if you do things like that, then there are criminal penalties and civil penalties that are really high. If you look at the criminal violations at the bottom of this graph, there's a term there called pattern or practice of hiring unauthorized aliens. Again, we're not going to intentionally do that, but that's the one piece I think all of us have to worry about. If your program is in such a shambles or has been ignored to such an extent that you've actually hired unauthorized aliens, they're on your payroll because you really didn't verify them, you could fall into that category of criminal violations for pattern or practice, even if you didn't intend to. So that's the things to watch out for. Make sure you do have a program, make sure you have done training, because now we're talking about individual liability. And as you see there, even for a first offense, you're talking about 6 months in prison. So that, that's serious. So make sure you're not doing that. But if you're doing your I-9s, if you're doing periodic trainings, you're not going to be in that category. What I will highlight is the second row here, failing to comply with Form I-9 requirements, and then the fourth row, committing document abuse, which I've mentioned before. Those are fines that I see quite often being imposed on companies who are audited or investigated for I-9 work. And let's break that out into the actual fine structure that the government has in its regulations. You'll see here that there are different amounts for first offenses, second offenses, and third offenses. Any I-9 that has a mistake that's not correctable would be a $110 fine at a minimum for the first offense. We'll skip the second and third offenses for sake of time, but going down from 110, you see that certain companies will be fined $935 per I-9 that's incorrect. And the way you get to that escalated fine per form is overall there have to be 50% or more of your I-9s that contain mistakes. And you might think, well, that's not going to be me. The truth is it probably is you if you haven't done internal audits or trainings. When I do internal audits, almost every single one results in forms that are at that 50% rate. And so that's kind of the reality of what I see out there. So how much of a fine would that be? Let's just do a quick example here. If you had 1,000 employees and there was a 50% error rate, so we had 500 I-9s that had mistakes on them, you would multiply 500 by 935, and you're at $465,000. That's $500,000 in a fine. So we're talking about some pretty big numbers for having, papers that are not in order, basically, or not done correctly. That is kind of the enforcement mechanism that the government has been imposing on employers. The other thing I've seen is that when I first started doing I-9 compliance audits or defense, investigation defense 10 years ago, 12 years ago, back then it was really easy to negotiate these fines down, either to a warning, or I would sometimes get a 90% discount on the fine that was implemented, and my clients thought I was a hero. These days, the government is not negotiating like that. It's much harder to get a discount because, as I say, they're focusing on this now and they're looking for the revenue. So that's kind of the reality on the ground that we've seen in the last 5 years or so. I'm just going to kind of skip over these couple slides here with criminal issues and penalties. We talked about that a little bit, and this group really doesn't have to worry about it. Just worry about that pattern in practice violation that you could fall into. That concludes our webinar on I-9 basics. Thank you for attending. I hope that it was valuable to you and that you learned a lot. Please join us for advanced topics in I-9 issues next month in our webinar. And if you plan to join us, if there are certain topics that you want to cover, send us an email and we'll try to work that into the presentation. Also, if you want a copy of these slides, send us an email and we'll send that over to you. Thank you for your attendance and have a great day. Bye-bye.